All right, so into week 4 of 28-day fat loss, and at a time where we can have a few mindsets floating about. Some people can be going super hard and, thinking it's the last day on earth coming up and cutting calories by half and trying to get that a little bit extra just for those last few days. And we can, on the flip side, we can have people that feel like it's pointless, it's useless, it's nearly over, 28 days, nearly done. What's the point? I didn't get my results that I'd hoped for. So with both of those mindsets, I want everyone to remember that it's not the end, that everything continues, life continues. 28 days in the scheme of things is a drop in the ocean. I want people to just think that it's continuing as normal. So the processes that you put in place are continuing, just like your exercise has to continue next week, just like you have to still go to work next week. Everything continues as normal. However, that being said, if there are people that have been quite strict throughout the 28 days and you feel like you've nailed the plan, nailed the program, then that's a time when you want to consider coming out of a deficit. So you've just been losing fat for 4 weeks straight. Now, when you think about what a deficit is, it's our body taking on less fuel than what it should to operate well. So operating ideally requires us eating a certain amount of calories, and we call them maintenance calories. And that's where we're going to get our ideal functioning. So not just physical functioning, but also cognitive functioning. So for our body to be in a consistent deficit, a constant deficit, we're not functioning optimally. We'll be fatigued. It will affect our brain power on a daily basis. So it's good for us to go through phases of deficit to achieve what we want to achieve fat loss wise, but it's also good for us to have breaks from that deficit phase. So this is probably one of the most important things, or the most important thing to talk about during a 28-day fat loss. So I want you to have an open mind with this, and here's the reasons why. So the body goes through what's called adaptive thermogenesis. So basically, the metabolism adapts to how much you feed it. So if we're feeding it a certain amount and it's not enough to maintain our current weight, then our body will adapt its processes and adapt the energy expenditure. So it will reduce how many calories you burn in a day to adapt to what you're feeding it. Now, always important to show you examples. This is probably the hardest thing to convince someone to do when they're getting rip-roaring results, is to take a diet break and take a step back. But please be aware that this is in order to get better results long-term. I've done it myself, works really well, and I really want you to have a look at this study that I've been introduced to. This particular study was looking to reduce or minimize the metabolic adaptation that occurs. Now, this is straight from Sports Nutrition Association, and utilizing nutritional periodization with diet breaks. So periodizing calorie deficit phases with calorie or diet breaks. So they're basically going into calorie maintenance instead of calorie deficit. Now, if you look at this graph, this was the group that had diet breaks. So they actually did 2 weeks of diet, 2 weeks of diet break, and in total, they did 16 weeks of diet. Now, after that 16 weeks, they lost 47% more weight than the group that did a consistent deficit for 16 weeks. So they just maintained the deficit the whole way through. And you see that curve begin to plateau. And at the end of the day, the average weight loss was 11 kilos. I must point out this study was done on men. So this was obese men. So they've lost 11 kilos. So a huge calorie deficit for 16 weeks of fat loss, an average loss of 11 kilos. And this group lost an average of 15.5 kilos, roughly. So they lost 47% more weight than the group that didn't have any diet breaks. All right. Now, the really important part of this study comes next. So they actually found that the rebound, so here's the fat loss, here's the end of the study. They then went through an energy balance phase, and then they let them go. The follow-up 48 weeks into the study actually shows that this group, on average, were only 3 kilos down after 48 weeks, when they were 10 or 11 kilos down here. So they basically did a yo-yo effect and rebounded back up to here. The group that did the diet breaks, and they didn't have the same sort of rebound effect here. And by the end of the 48 weeks, they still had 11 kilos down. So massive difference between this one and this one in terms of how much the rebound was. And remember, this follow-up is just letting people go and live their life. They stayed down an average of 11 kilos. These guys stayed down an average of 3 kilos. When at peak, they were at 11. So crazy numbers there, huge. And here's really where they're suggesting the difference happened. So the most important thing to note here is that the group that did diet breaks, which was this one, had a resting energy expenditure decrease of about 200 calories. This group was down close to 600 calories. How does that turn into a rebound effect? Well, if your resting energy expenditure is now less and it's down here as opposed to being up here, then when you go and enjoy yourself and have and overeat, those extra calories that you get in will affect you more and will put fat on quicker. So you will store fat faster because you're eating even more calories than your body needs. So if your resting energy expenditure is 2,400 as opposed to being 2,800, then if you eat 3,000 calories, if your resting energy expenditure is lower, then you're in a bigger surplus. So you put on fat a bit faster. Hope that makes sense. Now, I have done this. I have tried. My protocol was 2 weeks of deficit, 1 week maintenance. Biggest difference I found was my energy levels were good. Strength was great the whole way through. So that 1 week of maintenance helped me to maintain energy and lift well, perform well. And when I went into a consistent deficit of 8 weeks, I felt a huge difference in strength. And some of the numbers on my lifting, whether it was all psychological or not, but some of my numbers were down about 30% when I did a consistent deficit as opposed to just having diet breaks after 2 weeks. So some pretty damning evidence there that is exciting. But what I need you guys to do is have a really open mind. And how do we make this work? How do we just say, okay, well, I'm going to stop my deficit. I'm going to stop my results, halt them for a week or 2 or 3 or whatever, however long you want that maintenance to be. I recommend starting with 1 week. I did 1 week. And the reason I chose 1 week is because I didn't feel confident enough to stick to maintenance calories for 2 weeks when I wanted to see results. So if you're the same, you don't think you can stick to 2 weeks of maintenance calories and you want to just do one, then that's fine. Remember, this is a trial period and I need you to be accurate. The more accurate you are with this, rather than just blowing out for a week, we want to try and just increase our calories a little bit. And that way we can be more accurate, see if it works, go back into deficit, reduce the metabolic adaptation that can happen, and hopefully long-term lose faster like that group did that I showed you. So over time, remember, if you're not willing to do this, then you are reducing how fast you can lose weight long-term. If you have an open mind, you're willing to give it a crack, then you're increasing your chance of losing faster long-term and reducing this rebound effect that happens. Okay. But the way I think you need to decide is how important is performance to you. So if your main thing is you want to squat a certain amount of weight or run 10Ks or something like that, if it's performance-based is your main goal and fat loss comes second, then I really think that you need to do longer maintenance phases and shorter deficit phases, because you are going to notice a massive difference in your performance, not just short-term in that 2 weeks of maintenance, but also long-term. I see the most increase in performance comes in week 3 to 4. This is just my observations. Week 3 to 4 of deficit. So in a 20-day fat loss, last week, lots of people feeling fatigued, lots of people struggling. Some people didn't notice the difference because they might not have stuck to the plan. But there's week 3, there's always a few people feel lethargic. Now, we used to do a lot of 8-week challenges, and not saying we won't do any again, but often find that first 4 weeks is where most of the results are achieved. You're still in a deficit. And you're trying to hit that for 8 weeks, it's a really tough thing to achieve. So if I had complete control over what people do in that 8 weeks, I would probably get them to do 4 weeks deficit or 3 weeks deficit, and then have 2 weeks maintenance, perfect maintenance. That'd be wonderful, and then go hard again for deficit. So I want you to consider that. And the first time I ever went into this theory of maintenance and using it, it was really hard mentally for me to consciously bump my calories up, forfeit any results that week from a scale perspective, and basically be strict as well. So not, when I say strict, just making sure that I didn't just bump it up willy-nilly and have, twice as much as I was eating before. So I purposely was as accurate as possible because I love to use it as a bit of an experiment, trial and error. That's my motto. And so I basically ate the same food, just more of it, to achieve what I was predicting and guessing was maintenance. Now, it might have been slightly out, might not have hit the mark, but you get the idea. Now, what I noticed over the 5 months of doing that is my strength didn't change. So I was doing 2 weeks of calorie deficit and 1 week of maintenance only. 1 week, I chose 1 week because mentally I just couldn't push myself to do 2 weeks of maintenance. So over that 5 months of doing that, I noticed my strength stayed the same. So all my numbers on the weights was staying the same, was not losing any numbers when I was logging them. And that was unreal because when we're in a calorie deficit over 5 months, we expect to lose strength, lose performance, because we're not feeding our body what it needs to optimally function. Then I went to a phase of constant deficit for 8 weeks. and I noticed a drastic plummet in all my strength. Now, it wasn't in the first 2 weeks, but it was in those last 5 weeks where I noticed a humongous drop, and I'd say about 30%. Now, some of that would have been up here in psychology, but I noticed about a 30% decrease in a lot of my lifts, and I also felt like I was at more risk of injury, which you will be when you're in a constant deficit. So that's another positive to taking on board the idea of having deficit phases and maintenance phases, is that you're going to reduce your risk of injury, increase your performance, and long term, we're also going to stop that or reduce the adaptation of your metabolism. So there's a few positives there I want you guys to remember. I'm just going to jot those down for those that are a bit more visual. Let's go. Those 3 positives being performance. And it always feels good when your sessions are good, doesn't it? It feels terrible when you leave the gym feeling like you did nothing. And that's the point where I got to with that 8 weeks of constant deficit after doing it the other way. So reduced injury risk. We never want to injure ourselves because then it puts us way back. There was definitely, you just felt more muscle, more squeeze in the muscles. So that's just a sign that the brain is firing well and has the ability to activate those muscles. And obviously there's energy in the muscles. And the other one that I mentioned is the reduction in metabolic adaptation. And that metabolic adaptation is called downregulation. So that downregulation is basically the reduction in how many calories your body burns just to survive. And the theory is that's through reducing the incidental activity. Also, you might notice that, let's say, instead of walking around and feeling energized, you're laying on the couch a little bit more than you normally would. I'm sure we've all experienced times like that, especially if we've done a constant deficit. Now, any questions on that or any input from you guys in terms of any experience that you guys have had doing one challenge versus another challenge, or times you might have noticed or just realized that, oh yeah, that might have been because of that? Anything? All good?
I think 8 weeks was always tough, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You get that 4 week mark, 5th week.
Yes.
You saw numbers drop. Psychologically, it was always a little tough. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember when we were scanning some people at week 4, and one person had lost 6 kilos of body fat. And then by the end of the 8 weeks, and they were pretty strict, they didn't really sway much. By the end of the 8 weeks, they'd lost 8.5. So when you think about, 6 kilos of body fat on the in-body scan, and then only 8.5 in total, when nothing really changed, that's telling me that, metabolic downregulation had occurred in some way. All right, here we are. So yeah, I agree. So 8 weeks, when we do another one, I'm sure we will at some point, I'm going to talk about this sort of stuff and going through a week of maintenance. And, it's just as much of a mental challenge than as it is a physical challenge when you do that. And that's a good thing. It's always good to challenge yourself mentally with that sort of stuff. But trusting the process is a big one. All right. So I want to do a couple little case studies. Just a few people, I won't say any names, but just a few people that have hit a few roadblocks along the way. So many people hit roadblocks. It's normal. We all hit roadblocks at some point. So nothing wrong with how these guys went about the program. It's just the way it is. But I think it's important to not just ignore it and talk about everyone's amazing results and ignore these sort of things. All right. I particularly chose this one because this is more relating to salt and carbohydrates and how it can affect fluid amount in your body and how it can affect your weight on the scales. And I know people I say salt will affect your weight on the scales and so will carbohydrates, but I don't think people understand the full extent of how much. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm happy to see fluid in the body for a day or two. It doesn't worry me in any way. But when you're aware that it's going to happen, you can take it on board and just take it with a grain of salt. When you don't understand the extent of what happens, it can destroy your weight loss journey because you just give up and believe it's all over. Okay, so this is an example of someone that wasn't getting results and believing they were a bit of an exception to the rules. When I say the rules, I'm talking about the old calorie in, calorie out. You need to be in a calorie deficit. This amount of calories will get you fat loss. So this person's basically believing that they can't lose weight. And if they were going to, they'd have to go to a point where they're maybe really extreme. So going down to, say, 1,000 calories. Now, let's start by just reinforcing the idea of trusting the process and trusting whoever's giving you, well, not whoever's giving you advice, the person that you trust that's giving you the advice, which in this case is myself. And always remember that everything that we do is a guess, a scientific guess, and then we can adjust. So it's a trial. It's a trial and error. You trial it, you repeat it, and you adjust it, and you repeat it, and you adjust it, and you repeat it, and eventually we get to the bottom of it. Now, first question to this person, and they know who they are. First question to this person was, okay, so what are you measuring? And so you're doing the scales. Have you been doing the scales each week? And the answer was no. So they feel like they're not losing weight, but they're also not measuring weight. So that's number one. If we don't have a measure, how are we going to know if something's actually changing? And so I said, okay, well, I know you're not crazy. What makes you think you're not getting results? Well, I don't feel any different. So I still feel like a fat blob, I guess. So I'm thinking, okay, well, let's look at your logging. And then you look at the logging, and one day was 18, one day was 1450. Now, we calculated maintenance to be 1800 calories. So someone could look at this and say, oh, well, you're blowing out on the weekends. But I know that is not a blowout. That is, at the very most, that could be maintenance. But I still think that that's a deficit. So if the logging was accurate, then that doesn't explain anything. Okay, then we look at the food that was eaten, and we have potato bake, we have sausages, bacon. So then it's pretty easy to look at that and say, okay, we need to eat different types of food. But the fact of the matter is, all of this doesn't matter if we're still at maintenance or deficit calories. Yes, I wouldn't suggest to have those sort of foods every single day, because we might struggle to hit our protein requirements, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, you're not putting on any fat if you're not in a calorie surplus. So you've always got to remember that, okay? So then we think, okay, what's actually happening here? Why is it that this is causing an increase in weight? And not just a little bit, we're talking a kilo and a half of weight. Okay, this day, 1450 calories, we're looking at total, let's say just pitch your own ideal day. I don't care what it is, but pitch your own ideal day and just pretend it's that, made up 1450 calories. There's not a food on there or an ingredient on there that's dense in calories. It's just a basic standard meal plan day. Then we look at the sodium content, and you don't have to know how much this is, but 2,000 milligrams of sodium, 2,300. And on this day, we got 4,100 milligrams of sodium. So throughout the week, this person is eating roughly 2,000 milligrams of sodium, and don't worry about how much is normal. Wouldn't even worry about it. Just try and be consistent with your sodium intake. And then on this day, we're looking at 4,100. So almost double the amount of sodium in the day. And I mentioned before, sodium, salt. So sodium is in salt. Sodium holds fluid. So the other thing we look at is the carbohydrate content. And on this particular day, just 60 grams of carbohydrate, carbs. And on this day, 180 grams of carbohydrates. All right, so we've got 3 times the amount of carbohydrates, and we've got double the amount of sodium. Remember that the calories aren't that much different, and I'm totally happy with this amount of calories. So remember that's negligible. We're not even worried about that. So then we think, okay, well, we can still lose, if we've got that many calories, we can still lose fat. What's going on? I'm not exactly sure on the precise number, but from my understanding, 1 extra gram of carbohydrate will hold the equivalent of 2 to 3 grams of fluid. So if you've got 120 extra grams of carbohydrates, you've got somewhere between 240 to 360 mils of water extra on your body from the previous day. So this is why you can get on the scales and all of a sudden it's gone up 300 grams or it's gone up 400, 500 grams. Now, again, not exactly sure on the precise number, and I don't think it probably isn't even a precise number, but one that I have seen is 400 milligrams of sodium can hold the equivalent of 4 cups of water, which is a liter. So let's say this person has had an extra 1,800 milligrams of sodium compared to the previous day or a few days ago. Does that sort of add up to now why they're putting on so much weight after the weekend and weighing in heavy on a Tuesday, even though they're only sticking to 1,800 calories still? You know, they could be up 1.5 litres quite easily just like that. And that 1.5 litres is making their clothes feel tight. They feel puffy in the face, bigger everywhere. But remember that fat gain takes consistency. Fat loss takes consistency. To put on kilos and kilos of fat, you need to consistently be in a deficit. Surplus to put on kilos and kilos of fat. So always go back to that. Remember that if we are going to beat ourselves up after one meal, one social evening where we had something that put us just over the calories, just remember that most of it's probably going to be fluid. And we would need to do that night after night, week after week, month after month to achieve consistent fat gain. So it all comes back to consistency. And if you can get your head around these numbers, basically that day, even though the calories were right, let's say it put on an extra 1.5 kilograms of weight, plus there was no exercise, no sweating. So it could be even more than that. So you can see how now this could really affect someone's mindset at the start of a week, after a weekend, or after a big night eating pizza and having a few drinks. At the end of the day, brush it off, start the new day, and don't be consistently like that. Don't be consistently eating pizza and having heaps and heaps of drinks and whatnot to consistently just go up in weight. Alrighty? So, questions on that one?
So how much is a good amount of sodium per day?
I wouldn't worry about it too much. Everyone's a bit different. Unless you have blood pressure issues, then you should really look at it. But we know you definitely don't, Jill. Also the risk of going under with sodium, because if you're getting cramps and things, we've got to watch that. So athletes can get a lot of cramping because they sweat so much, lose so much salt, they need to replace all that. And, you know, I don't know if you remember when Tim Franklin did a talk with us, an ultra marathon runner. You know, his go-to was a bag of salty chips.
Yes.
Just to get enough calories in, and also get some salt in the system. So salt isn't such a bad thing in a hot climate. In summer, I up my salt intake, and it's just a how you feel type thing. So if I feel like I'm cramping up a lot, I will actually look at what I'm eating throughout the day, and I actually look at the things that are salty, and if there's not enough going in, I'll up that.
So 1,500, and that is be all right?
Yeah, 1,500 is like the, there is guidelines. It's sort of the recommended intake, but I would suggest that in summer that will probably be too low for you, Jill. That's definitely out of my scope, so don't take that on too much. But if you're exercising 2 or 3 times a day, then you might need to up that. But 1,500 is if there was a healthy amount, 2,000 milligrams is the average intake recommended, I think. Something like that. But to give you an example, I've had 6,000 and on a regular basis, and I questioned my dietitian, and he said, "No, don't even worry about it. All good."
Interesting when you look back over your food as to which days you've got higher sodium
Yeah.
and what you had.
Yeah.
I was having a 3-egg omelette, but I was putting ham in there, and it just smashes the sodium.
Yeah, but I want you to know from a body fat percentage point of view, don't even worry about that, because the sodium is not going to affect that. Where was I going next? Oh, and you can also understand why bread gets a bad rap. Bread has carbohydrates, which holds fluid. Bread has sodium in it, which holds fluid. Someone jumps on the scales after a week of having bread compared to a week where they skip carbs and have only salad, fluid's up. And despite them lifting PBs in the gym because they had more carbohydrates in their system, the weight on the scales will often be the winner in their mind. So they'll choose the one with the lower carb option. Remember, calories is king. All right, so always think, calories first, nail that, and then we can think about protein requirements and whatnot. All right, let's move on from that. So I'm sure we've all gone through this at some point, and if you can't remember it, that's great, because it didn't scar you for life. But I know I have, so I'm sure some of us can understand this. It's pretty natural for us to eat more at dinner and less at breakfast. Am I right? Like, pretty easy to go, all right, I'm pretty busy, I'm just going to sleep in a little bit longer, skip breakfast, go to work. And then by the time I actually get to eat, it's lunchtime, and then get home and I'll have a big dinner because I get to sit down and enjoy it, and I've earned that after a big day at work. Now that's all well and good. Remember that the calories is king, and we can still get fat loss if our dinner's big and our breakfast is small. We can get that. However, what tends to happen is that we can get quite hungry, and because we're hungry, we can then eat more than we usually would at a meal. So in circumstance A, we have someone that can't control themselves after dinner, snacking at work. So we start to think, okay, well, what's happening here? What are you having for breakfast? Okay, no breakfast. Okay, well, when's your first energy being taken into the day? Well, a coffee. All right, so mid-morning coffee, let's say maximum of 200 calories if it's full cream milk, about 100 if it's skim. And then what are we doing? Okay, we're going to work. Okay, well, snacking at work is one of our problems. So then we start to think, all right, well, why are you snacking at work? Well, you're hungry. Well, I don't feel hungry. I'm just doing it because it's there. Guarantee your body's thinking, where's the food I haven't eaten all morning. What's going on? When am I going to eat next? So sometimes we don't even realize that we're hungry until it's too late, I would say, or you might not even realize it all. So that's also something to consider is, are you hungry? No. Well, should you be hungry, do you think? Probably should be, because I haven't had breakfast. I've only had a coffee all morning. It's now lunchtime, and I'm finding myself uncontrollably snacking on things. All right, so we nailed this a few weeks back, snacking at work. We got past that, but it came down to willpower because despite asking this person to start eating breakfast, they decided to battle it with willpower alone by just snacking on veg and fruit. So all of a sudden, it's now 3 o'clock, and they still haven't had a meal that you would call a meal until, let's say, 3 p.m. Now, the next issue was that they can't control themselves after dinner. This is the main issue, is they can't control themselves after dinner. So after dinner, eating, so they've had a decent-sized dinner because they're pretty hungry, let's say 500 calories. And then after dinner, they have a block of chocolate, 1,100 calories. All right? Block of chocolate. Every single night, or most nights, more often than not. Can you see why? All right. Despite what's happened in the afternoon, let's say in the afternoon they've caught up their calories, so they've had whatever. Let's say all of their calories between 3 p.m. and most of their calories between 3 p.m. and dinner. So there's, let's say, 4 or 5 hours of eating. Post dinner, if they're still behind or still under their calories, which would be pretty easy to be because it's pretty hard to eat all your calories in 5 hours, then their body's still going to be craving. And if there's something available, your body's going to tell you to eat it. So all of a sudden that block of chocolate's gone. And because it's so dense in calories, it's quite easy to consume such a small amount of food for such high calories. If that 1,100 calories was in a bowl of if it was 2 bowls of oats, it'd be a lot harder to consume that. But in a convenient package that's about 200 grams of food, quite easy to consume. And then we think, okay, well, why is the mind? Why can't we just go, all right, well, what about half a block? What about a quarter of a block? What about 2 rows? The reality is that your mindset is thinking, when am I going to eat next? There's no breakfast. There's a coffee for morning tea, and then we're snacking on fruit and veg. If my mind's in survival mode or in enjoyment mode, and if I like eating, then I'm going to get I'm going to eat as much as I can there, because when am I going to eat next? So flip that mindset, start eating breakfast, and you might actually find that, all right, well, number one, I'm super full after breakfast. Then we have some morning tea. Then all of a sudden the snacking on chips and stuff is easy. It's not down to willpower. It just comes naturally. We don't even want to snack on fruit and veg anymore because we're full. And then the block of chocolate disappears because you're going to wake up and have to eat a massive breakfast. So for this particular person, this is where it gets exciting. I can find it.
I have it, Josh.
Yeah, okay, well, let's bring on Pippa. Case study number B. So when you go through well, I've been with you 8 or 9 years, Pip, and we've gone through dieting for 8 or 9 years, you start to limit how much you can eat. So the way we approached this was, okay, Pip, what do you want to eat for breakfast? How much can you eat for breakfast? I want you to eat as much as you can, obviously not feel like you're going to vomit, but as much as you want to eat so that we go into work satisfied. So, and then she told me, and I doubled it. So we ended up getting 700 calories at breakfast. And then we went for a snack of 500, I think it was, Pip. So now instead of going into work on 200 calories, we're now going into work on 1,200 calories. So she's effectively had the energy content of a block of chocolate before going into work, but in bigger foods that are going to fill the belly and make her increase the amount of satiety that she has. So protein rich, high fiber, all those things, and high fluid content, so lots of water in those foods. So all of a sudden going in there feeling stuffed and not even wanting to eat. So the chips are now not calling out a name. That meal, that block of chocolate was the equivalent of 200 grams of yogurt. If anyone knows how much that is, it's a fair bit. 200 grams of yogurt, 100 grams of berries, some slivered almonds, a full scoop of protein powder, 2 slices of toast with 30 grams of thick spread of peanut butter. That's for breakfast. And then the snack was 4 thin rice cakes, a banana, more peanut butter on both of those rice cakes, an apple, and another tub of yogurt. That was the equivalent of the block of chocolate.
Wow.
So that's a massive amount of food that Pip's now going into work on, but she set herself up for a good day And now, and working out, and the reason why we went so high on these calories is basically she's going to work not feeling satisfied. We need her to feel satisfied. And her fat loss calories are calculated to be 2,500. So we could even up this. We could increase that more if she gets confident enough to eat less in the evening. The other benefits of eating that much food is I guarantee you're working more efficiently. Your brain will be functioning quite well throughout the morning. So fat loss and satiety aside, there'll be other benefits to that as well. What have you noticed? I mean, it hasn't been a long, Pip, and
No.
it takes repetition to keep doing this. And you can have a week where you get lazy and don't make breakfast and whatnot. It's going to happen from time to time. But the theory is always going to be there. And you've experienced, day one, you sent me a text saying, what'd you say?
Okay, so full or something? So good?
Yeah, feeling satisfied, don't even want to. And then the next day I sent Pip a text saying, how'd you go today? Did you repeat? She said, yep, I'm on repeat, not feeling hungry, feeling satisfied. And how is it now? About 4 or 5 days in now, Pip?
Yeah, good. I think the increase in energy, it's easier to get up in the morning and eat breakfast.
Awesome, good.
Yeah, and happier mood-wise, I guess.
Great.
Like, just easy to get through the day in a good mood.
Yeah. And Hutch alluded to this a few weeks ago, saying, when you've got something to look forward to at brekkie, it's easy to get out of bed, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
Get out of bed, Nick.
yeah. When you're not going to eat for 6 or 7 hours, there's one less thing to look forward to because food is pleasure, and it's important that your meal plan is enjoyable, and that's why we've got your meal plans to suit you, Pip, with the peanut butter because you're going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
What else was I going to say there? That's probably about it. So pretty fascinating, guys, and that's where, if you trust the calories and you're logging and whatnot. Now, Pip wasn't logging, so she's going to have no idea how much she can eat, and I don't know how much she can eat until I do the calculations and log, and so that's where I think logging is super valuable from time to time to build your relationship with food rather than break it down. There's such a stigma around logging being obsessive and causing eating disorders. Guarantee there's more people that have healthily lost weight from logging than there are that have come out with an eating disorder. So yeah, just keep logging and go away from it from time to time when let's say fat loss isn't such a priority, and life, other things are a bit more of a priority in your life, but always come back to it when you have no idea what's going on.
How would you get an eating disorder out of logging?
Well, see, people can think that, and it's very easy. Like if I say 2,500 is your calories to maintain, then people can try and hit that or hit the number every single day on the head, and it becomes quite obsessive. So if you do understand that, to put on a kilo of fat, you do need a surplus over a period of time of 7,000 calories. So, case study number A is not going to hit that in a day. They put on 1.5 kilos, but I guarantee they didn't eat 10,000 calories to have a surplus of 7,000. That takes consistent overeating to put on 1 kilo of adipose tissue, which is fat. But the same on the flip side, you need consistency to get a 7,000 calorie deficit to lose 1 kilo of fat. So if you lose 1 kilo overnight, it's not all fat, because unless you ran 14 kilometers and didn't eat that day, you're not going to have a 7,000 calorie deficit. Actually, no, 140 Ks. Unless you ran 140 kilometers and didn't eat that day, then you're not going to have a 7,000 calorie deficit, if that makes sense. All right. So end of the day, remember that week 4, 28 out of 28 days is not the end. Not, it all continues beyond. Consider maintenance phase and how to calculate your maintenance. Go through the playbooks, calculate your calories, and then instead of calculating for fat loss, go with the first number you get, which for ease is 22 times your body weight times your activity factor. So for me, 22 times 95 times 1.4. So my maintenance is calculated to be roughly 29.30, and from trial and error, I know that that is not 100% correct, and putting it down to myself having a bit more muscle mass on my body, which burns a little bit more energy, I actually maintain around 3,300. So if I hit on days, if I go to 36 and then another day I hit 29, at the end of the day, it's going to balance out. Don't get too obsessive on it, but know where you're at, and also don't get complacent with it. All right, I think that'll do it today.
That's great, mate. I reckon I've learnt more in this 4 weeks than I had in 4 years.
Great, mate.